Yo, what is good everybody? It's your boy Tej, and in this video I'm gonna be showing y'all how Southside and Pyrex would make beats for Nardo Wick and Doughboy and any other artist that would use a dark beat similar to this. I mean the entire beat from scratch, so I'm gonna be showing y'all my whole process of making the sample and adding drums to it. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. As always, I'll have the finished beat played at the end of the video, so be sure to stick around for that. And with all that out of the way, let's just hop right into the beat. I'm going to show y'all a quick preview of the sample before I break it down. Alright, so for the tempo that I chose 156 BPM. I think anything really in like the kind of faster range, so like probably 140 to like 165 would probably work pretty well. For my first melody sound, I got this edamame key preset from Analog Lab, specifically this Astral Bank. And the finished sample is 3 half steps up from the MIDI. So the notes in the MIDI are in A sharp minor and the finished sample is in C sharp. And this MIDI pattern is a slightly modified version of a MIDI that was made by MaxShooter49, so shout out to him. He's the one that actually created the idea for this MIDI. And for these types of beats and melodies, you probably want to use something that's fairly repetitive, so something like this is perfect. So all it really is just utilizing this D sharp minor chord and just using other notes in the scale just to kind of supplement it. It's using the second and third notes relative to D sharp, so F and F sharp for the top notes here, and pretty much for the rest of it, it's just using octaves of D sharp. So routing that to the mixer track, I put some halftime on it. I just put it on the default 1-bar loop setting, and then I put the mode to 1.5. So the original key of the MIDI was D sharp minor, but since we moved it to this 1.5 mode, it actually moves it down to A sharp minor. Next, I put some RC20 on it, and I put this Lush and Crunch Guitar 2 preset. I turned off the noise and adjusted the distortion and space knobs. And then lastly, I put on an EQ just to cut out some of the lows and some of the harsher sounds in the low mids. For my next melody sound, I went into Omnisphere and I got this Palace 808 Mafia Omnisphere bank, and I used this bell preset right here. I just put in this accent bell pattern. I just used like small little licks of 3 notes, just going to the 1/3 beat, snap setting, and just putting in the notes here and letting the last ones ring out a little bit. And for effects on that, I just put a bandpass EQ and cut out some of the harshness in the mids. For my third melody sound, I opened up another Omnisphere and I got this guitar preset from the same Omnisphere bank I used in the previous sound. And I went in and just created an A sharp minor chord. And so we just started with A sharp, C sharp, and F, also known as the A sharp minor triad. Just went in and played around with some of the notes. So I added a C and an F sharp and just added in a couple notes here and there just to kind of make it sound a little bit interesting. By itself, it sounds like this. And with effects, it sounds like this. For effects, I put a low cut EQ. I put a fruity reverb on it, the venue preset, and I went into halftime and just left it as the default settings. I went into effectrix and put in this factory preset here, and that's how we got that sort of stuttery and like reverse delay type of feel. And so I just rendered that out by itself. So I armed the mixer track by clicking this button right here and hitting Alt-R on my keyboard, or you can just go to the top left here and go to disk recording and render to WAV files. And once I had that, I rendered it out to the channel rack here. Notice there was a stutter at the start of the pattern originally, so what I did is I just cut it out and I shifted the pattern back, and that way it just starts on an actual note. And I also pitched it up 300 cents like I did with the rest of the sample elements when I rendered out the stems, and I re-recorded that into a new clip. That way they were all consolidated. And I took that clip and I cloned it and I pitched it up by 1 octave. And what I did after that is I made a volume automation clip, as you can see below it. And so how I did that is I just clicked on the top left of the audio clip and I went to automate and volume, and then an automation clip will pop up, and I just kind of just went in and drew in whatever I felt like. So by itself, it sounds like this. So throwing all those elements together with what we have so far and pitched up to C sharp minor. And then lastly, we just added the sub bass, and the bass sound comes from the Astral Bank in Analog Lab and is the Mercenary preset. And I just drew in this fairly basic bass pattern right here. I just used my first note in the scale, or the root note, C sharp, and built the pattern using the other notes in that same minor scale. So one more time, the finished sample sounds like this. I took all those stems and I arranged a loop and rendered out the entire thing as a wave file. So once I imported that wave into a new project file, I arranged the stems to my liking and added the drums on top of it and finished the rest of the beat. I pitched up the sample by 200 cents or 2 half steps. The rendered out version of the sample is in C sharp minor, so the key that the final track is in D sharp minor. The first drum sound that I grabbed was this clap snare combo sort of sound. And as you can see, it's a little bit different than just like my typical clap pattern where I have it on the 3rd beat of every measure. For the most part, it still follows that same pattern. I just added a couple accents here, but the claps in the 4th measure are shifted a little bit. So it's almost as if I had it like this, but I shifted it over by 1 beat, and I used the velocities to kind of adjust how they hit. So certain claps will hit harder than others, and that just kind of adds some extra bounce to your drums. Moving on to the next drum sound, I have this hi-hat. Overall, I didn't really do anything too complicated with these. I just went and used the 1/2 step snap setting and just used the paintbrush tool and kind of went in and penciled in some notes. I kind of wanted to put my own unique spin on it, so I put in these lower hi-hat rolls. Obviously, that's not a totally unique technique to me. I just felt like it sounded a little different than some of the hi-hats that I hear in certain tracks. But for hi-hats, you could definitely get a little more experimental. Try to keep it fairly in control, because at the end of the day, ideally, we'd want an artist to rap on top of it. And when I routed that to a mixer track, I put some effectrix on it, and I kept it pretty simple. I just threw this reverse right here and a reverb, and I'm using the 1/8 tempo setting. Next, I put in this rising open hat sound to kind of pair up with some of the spots in the hi-hat. So I put a normal pitch one right here, and then in the same spot in the second half of the pattern, I just pitched it down to A. And then next, I added my good old 1-2 punch of hi-hats. The first one being that traditional southside hi-hat. I put these in the normal spots, so the second beat of the 2nd and 6th measures, and then I added an accent one at the end of the 7th. And then I used another southside hi-hat, and I stuck that on the 2nd beat of the 4th and 8th measures. And then I put in the snare pattern. Overall, I kept this pretty simple. I wasn't really feeling like adding too many crazy details to the snare, although I definitely could have. Overall, fairly standard snare pattern when it comes to the bass notes here, and just added a couple typical sounding snare rolls. And lastly, the part of the beat that just makes everything sound so much more cohesive, the 808. So since the entire sample kind of just runs along that same kind of plane of D sharp, I used this note the most. However, I felt like just using that got kind of boring. So I definitely threw in some variations here and there, mostly the A sharp and the B notes. And at the end, I octaved it with D sharp again. But other than that, I think it's fairly straightforward 808 pattern. I didn't want to go too crazy with it because I already had a lot going on with some of my other drum sounds. So that's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video. Hope you're able to take something away from it. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a like. And if you want to see more content like this, be sure to hit subscribe. Leave any feedback or recommendations you may have in the comments below. And that's all for me. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Peace.
Why don't you run with this, Tej?